Thank you very much for joining us for this ERI seminar. Our guest speaker is Yvette Dickinson. And she is from Scion, and she will be presenting about designing forests.
Yeah, I can take it from you, Joshua, if you like. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to come talk. Yeah, so my name's Yvette Dickinson. I'm one of the portfolio leaders and also a scientist at Scion over in Rotorua. And so a little bit of my background, I guess I would call myself a forest ecologist sometimes. So, more often you'll hear me call me a silviculturalist, which is basically a forest ecologist that likes to work in forests that are managed for some purpose. Often that is timber, but not always. So I've worked in all sorts of different systems, both here in New Zealand, and both our industrial forests and also our native forests. And also I worked for a little while over in North America in Pennsylvania, Colorado, and then up in Michigan. So what I wanted to talk with you guys today about is some of the work that we're doing at Scion. And so I called my portfolio that I lead is called Designing Forests Mahi, Tahi, Whaihua. Mahi, Tahi, Whaihua really refers to working together as one. And so it refers to the idea that we're managing forests for multiple purposes, but also that we have many people working together for kind of one identity. First of all, I want to apologize to those that really love data and numbers. You're not going to see a whole lot of that today. What I wanted to do was spend a bit of time introducing Scion, because I'm not sure how familiar people are with what we do. A little bit about the kind of area that I work in within Scion, and then a little bit of a potential vision of where forestry could go in New Zealand. And you'll see why it's so connected to some of the things that I think folks are interested in here. I also want to just acknowledge that a lot of this work is not my own. Some of it is my own with graduate students. Some of it is work that we're doing at Scion. And so I'm more than happy to answer questions and dive more deeply, but I may also hand you off to my colleagues that know a hell of a lot more about some of these topics. But I'm always happy to connect. And that was one of my hopeful purposes of this talk, was to really connect with folks so that you have a bit of an understanding of what we're really interested in, and maybe find some connections as well, so that we can work together with other folks. So who are we at Scion?
It's not advanced.
No, but let's try this. There we go. I'll use the mouse. So our vision at Scion is prosperity from trees. And you'll notice that's really broad. At Scion, we are one of the Crown Research Institutes. We're one of the smallest ones. So we are essentially a government-owned company. But we're interested in what sometimes I call nose-to-tail forestry. So we do everything from breeding trees, genetics, working in the nurseries to produce seedlings, through to planting them in forests, managing forests, harvesting them, turning them into products, wood products in particular, but also some of the bioplastics and other products, bioenergy. So we do the whole gamut. We also do a lot of social science. And we're not just interested in or working in, radiata pine plantation forestry industry. We do a lot of work both in native forests and in other types of exotic forests as well. So really all trees in the landscape. And we're moving also outside of forests these days as well, as you'll see. So our purpose is really to drive innovation and growth from New Zealand's forestry, wood product and wood-derived materials and other biomaterial sectors to create economic value and contribute to beneficial environmental and social outcomes for New Zealand. So we're not just interested in financial outcomes. We are very focused on sustainability, those wider environmental benefits and those wider social benefits as well. And our vision really is what we're calling the new circular bioeconomy. This is definitely one of those catchphrases that you'll hear across the globe being used. But the idea being that wood and wood products can basically replace everything that you can use steel, concrete, by petrochemicals for. In addition to replacing those materials that might have some environmental negative outcomes, the growing of forests themselves, standing forests, have a lot of benefits for us. Things like mitigating climate change, habitat for biodiversity, erosion controls, clean air, protecting clean air and soil and water. But also not just creating these products, but also recycling them as well. So the idea that we want to replace the use of those petrochemicals by using bioproducts, but then we want to be able to continually cycle through and reuse them. So we have folks at Scion that are really interested in that part of the potential bioeconomy as well. So just also wanted to wave the flag for forestry in New Zealand a little bit, in that it is actually quite an important industry for New Zealand. It's maybe one that doesn't get it as recognised as important as it is. So depending what year and how you account for it, it's one of our kind of top 3-4 export earners for New Zealand, up there with things like tourism, dairy, beef, sheep and beef, those kinds of industries. So typically it's about a 6 billion a year income into New Zealand from our exports, which is about 1.6 of the GDP. But if we were to move to that circular bioeconomy vision, we've estimated that that's maybe up to a $30 billion economic proposition for New Zealand. And that forests in New Zealand just occupy quite a bit of our landscape as well. It's about 38% of our landscape is forests, whether that's indigenous forests or the productive industrial forests or just other forests across the landscape. And that employing a lot of people as well, so about 35,000 people in New Zealand employed directly, and a lot of those jobs are in the regions as well, outside of cities. So Scion, we are one of the smaller CRIs. Last year we had about 348 employees. That's a little bit lower this year. We have been around for a long time. We're not new. So we have a history, been around about 75 years in different formats. And in terms of company size, we have about $64 million of revenue a year. So just to give you an idea of how big we are, we do quite a diverse range of research. So really to achieve our vision of prosperity from trees, the organisation is broken down into 3 main areas, 3 impact areas. We talk about forests and landscapes, which is where I sit in the organisation. We've got another area, my colleagues, who are focused on forest to timber products, and then a third area, forest to bio-based products. And between those 3 impact areas, we really have this vision of being able to support New Zealand economy, which is really important, obviously, but that also supports communities, provides jobs. There's a role for forestry and Maori economic development, which is quite important. But also we've got the twin global crises of climate change and biodiversity, and a number of other social challenges facing us globally. We see a role in forests to mitigate that. So the forest and landscapes area is really focused on those trees for standing values, both exotic and indigenous forests. My 2 colleagues and I that work in this area, they're focused on establishing indigenous forests, so very much focused on restoration, trying to increase nursery production of indigenous trees and bring down the costs of restoration and figure out how can we do it on big scales. My other colleague is leading an area called Restoration Protection and Maori, or Oti Wainoi Tane, which is very much around the biosecurity and health of our native forests. So thinking about kauri dieback, myrtle rust, and some of those other diseases and threats, as well as climate change and wildfire. And then there's my area, designing forests, which I'll talk a little bit more about and talk through what our goals within designing forests is. Across my colleagues in the forest and timber products area, they're very much focused more on industry. So thinking about how do we sustainably produce high volume, high quality timber products, very focused on this idea that wood can replace things like concrete and steel, that can help combat climate change because you won't have those emissions coming from those building materials, but also that you can have actually negative carbon building. So there's more carbon stored in the building and these mass wood timber high rises than is emitted in the construction of those buildings. And if you want to see a great example, come visit us over in Rotorua. We've got a building over there that's just been constructed in the last 4 years, which is carbon negative. And it's really amazing, 3 stories, solid wood, and all those places you would normally see concrete. And there's now globally buildings hundreds of stories high going up that are solid wood and mass wood buildings. So very cool technology in there. And then forest to bio-based products, very focused on bioplastics, replacing petrochemical type plastics. Packaging for food and other products is a major challenge. So thinking about how can we use wood-based packaging. Bioenergy being another area, and particularly those uses of energy that are very hard to replace with batteries, solar, electrical, wind. So we're thinking about like marine biofuels as one major area. It's an area that's very hard to replace with those other technologies. So there's some really exciting work happening in there. Okay, so focusing on designing forests, Mahi, Tahi, Whaihua. So our vision in this area is forest systems that are really designed around the needs and values of communities that restore, enhance New Zealand's natural capital, delivering sustainable and resilient portfolios of ecosystem functions and equitable outcomes over generations. So really focused on sustainability, focused on forests for their values as forests, and thinking about those multiple benefits that we can get at the same time. Full range of ecosystem services coming from these forests. And we're not limited to thinking about just indigenous or just exotic forests. We're rather species agnostic. And so we are thinking about places where we might mix those together, or where natives or exotic species might have some advantages. And so I think that the information on this slide will be nothing new to people within ERI. I'm very much preaching to the choir here, but globally we're facing some really big challenges. So obviously in the top corner there, we've got climate change. It seems to be a real increasing focus. It is a crisis, and we are really focused on thinking about how to mitigate that with forests, but also how do we adapt and prepare for the change that's coming. And I know that using forests to mitigate climate change is somewhat controversial. I'm not suggesting that that's the solution, but I think it is one solution in a whole suite of different things we should be doing. I think where it can be useful is buying us a little bit more time, can offer a solution in the short term while we figure out the root cause of the problem and actually make some bigger changes that need to happen. With climate change is coming all these really extreme events that we've started seeing here and overseas. So we have like the events that happened in Tairāwhiti and Hawke's Bay in 2023, where we had really intense storms, lots of water, high winds, and erosion occurring. That's a place where we think forestry or trees maybe not forestry as people picture it. Trees can help play a role in that to mitigate those erosion, that erosion we're seeing and sedimentation that we're seeing in some of those landscapes. Of course, I can't talk about that without talking about the slash problem. Absolutely, that's somewhere that we need to make some changes in what we're doing. I'm not going to deny that at all. What you might not be aware is in that same event in southern Taupo, Turangi area, there was massive wind throws that happened, really strong winds that funnel through there. There was a one company in particular that lost a huge amount of forest. As you can imagine, as a company that's trying to grow a product over a 20 to 30 year rotation length, losing a huge amount of your estate in one event can be catastrophic, because essentially it hits the ground and starts decaying, and you need to either use it really quickly or figure out some other way of starting replanting the new forest. So we need to think about how do we build forests that are able to deal with some of these extreme events. We also have in parts of the globe insect and disease outbreaks occurring due to climate change, at least in part, and we have the direct effects of drought and heat stress. And on top of that, we've got the biodiversity crisis occurring as well. And obviously forests can play a huge role in that crisis. While plantation forests and some of the exotic forests aren't going to create perfect old growth habitat, they are still really valuable habitats. And so there's some various roles that we think these forests or new kinds of forests could play across the landscape. And so I think some of the stuff that David Hall published a couple of years ago actually really nailed it for what my vision is for the potential future of forests and land use in New Zealand, where we're moving from a really siloed world into a more interwoven world. So just generalizing across New Zealand at the moment, we've got really strong native conservation forests, which we manage really intensively for one purpose, conservation. We've got these exotic commercial forests, which we manage really intensively. We're literally world leaders in terms of production forestry, but we're managing them for one purpose. And then we've got these pastoral agricultural landscapes, which once again, we're managing basically for one purpose. I jokingly say New Zealanders don't do multiple things at once very well. But in this vision that we have for the future, or I have for the future, we can start putting trees in more places across the landscape, integrating them in, so not replacing one, agriculture with forestry, but rather integrating them in to get the best of both worlds, using trees in a really sustainable, smart way to prepare for climate change and mitigate climate change and help with the biodiversity crisis and these other challenges that we're facing. So we might start to see systems a bit more like the agroforestry type systems. We might start to see more mixed plantation forests, so we're not just having one species that's at risk to outbreaks and disease, but rather hedging our bets and mitigating that risk. Yes, carbon forests, I think, are part of that solution, whether they're exotic or native. Potentially some of the natural-based solutions or nature-based forestry, close to nature forestry, it's sometimes called continuous cover forestry. Those are all synonyms really for one thing, which is managing complex indigenous forests on a sustainable basis where you're maintaining the forest while still harvesting. But we're still maintaining those original uses that we already have. We're all really good at conservation forests, we're really good at plantations, we're really good at agriculture. Let's keep doing that, but let's add some other options into the system. So a couple of years ago, a group of us at Scion published a paper that was focused on transitional forestry, but we proposed that rather than just focusing on these transitions of exotic through to native forests, that we actually need to think about how do we go from this very single-use kind of forestry of reserves and plantations to having more of this grey area in between where we're managing for multiple purposes, getting multiple benefits from at the same time from these forests. And there's a whole suite of potential options, a rainbow of different forest systems we could use. So we still want to keep that intensive conservation, things like mainland islands, indigenous conservation forests. We want to keep those. We're not going to necessarily change what we do there. But we want to add to that things like the exotic to indigenous transitions, indigenous species plantations, the near natural forestry. Food forests is one that we've started thinking about a lot more at Scion. Those trees integrated into farms, urban forests, mixed species plantations, exotic carbon forests, alternative species plantations, bioenergy forests, and precision silviculture. So we're still doing some of the classic conventional forestry, but adding to the richness, giving options to landowners. And so the area that I'm trying to work in is really in that grey space in the middle, thinking about what other ways could we manage forests and trees. And I have some examples of these that I wanted to share with you. Some of them are from New Zealand, some of them are from my experience overseas. And we've already got some work happening in some of these places. So this is actually a photo from Adam Forbes, who's an independent consultant and expert in does a lot of work in transition forestry. But this is an example of those exotic to indigenous transitions. We have a lot of places in New Zealand now that we have exotic forests that we might not want exotic forests. So thinking about how do we move away without doing a massive clear-cut replant sudden shift, but how do we transition slowly? And we also have places where actually planting exotics might help kickstart that restoration process, that the exotic trees may act as something of a nurse crop. It may also provide some advantages in terms of income from the land. So there are folks proposing that you could plant exotic trees to start with, have fast growth and early income from carbon sequestration, but then over time transition to indigenous species and get the advantages of long-term indigenous forests and long-term carbon storage. There's a lot of science that we need to figure out behind that before we can make it, be confident that we can do it at a big scale. So there's some really interesting conversations happening and early work happening in that space. This is an example from Michigan of indigenous plantations. So this is jack pine being planted, machine planted for timber production. Jack pine is a good timber species, pulp and paper and sawlog in that part of the world. But they're also managing for this warbler that's on the endangered species list. It's a neotropical migrant that moves back and forwards between the tropics and northern Michigan region. And they've had massive successes with this kind of management. You'll notice the plantations have quite a unique pattern to their planting. Essentially, they're trying to create that habitat that the warbler really loves, some openings and some dense forest mixed together. They've seen really nice improvements in the population, in part because of the management, but they're able to do it economically because of the way that they're planting, and they are able to harvest these trees and move the habitat around the landscape. So a really positive kind of example. Scion has been working on indigenous plantations here in New Zealand for quite a long time. This is a photo of Greg Stewart, who's recently retired, but he's been working on this basically his full career. And these are kauri plantations. So they're a native species being planted with the goal of a timber harvest at the end, but getting all that benefit of an indigenous species in between. And this is different sites. So we've got a site here down in Hawke's Bay, one in the Bay of Plenty area, and one closer to Auckland. We've also looked at other species. So this is Rimu and Tokra plantations, once again thinking about timber production eventually, but using an indigenous species and trying to get the advantages of having an indigenous species forest, trying to get that multiple benefit. And we have seen, at least with the kauri plantations, that in the right place, under the right conditions, we can get growth rates really similar to radiata pine. So we think in some places this could really work, but it's still, we're still working on it slowly. Another option might be that close to nature type forestry. So these are actually photos from some work I was doing in the Northern Michigan area again. This is a Maple Beach birch forest. And believe it or not, this photo of the forest is only 6 months after a harvest. And literally there is a stump. You can't see it in the photo, but it's right in the middle of that little opening that the photo is taken of. And so this is a very normal way of doing forestry in that part of the world. They're managing for multiple benefits. They're managing native forests, native species, getting the benefit of a timber harvest and that social benefits that come from having a rural economy and jobs, but also they've got great benefits in terms of biodiversity and habitat. So they're balancing those different uses in one place. And just to demonstrate that this is industrial forestry in that part of the world, this is the same forest when it was being harvested. They are just like the harvesting systems that we use here, just tweaked a little bit. And so a lot of the research that we were doing there was really looking at the ecology of the species. So sugar maple, yellow birch, paper birch, white pines, and thinking about how that matches up with different kinds of forest management that we could do in the different systems that we had on hand, and realizing that we could tweak the different systems to get the different species regenerating. We weren't planting anything, it's also all natural regeneration, but just by simply changing the forest system, the way we were harvesting, we were able to get different benefits coming from the forest. And this is something that we could absolutely do in New Zealand for our forest types here. Prior to the CRIs being created, so in the kind of 70s, 80s, there was some research in this area happening, and there are some examples of the original New Zealand Forest Service trying to do some of this. There hasn't been a lot of work more recently. There's been a little bit here and there, and the rest of the world's kind of moved forwards in leaps and bounds. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to now catch up, learn from them, and apply some of these systems in New Zealand potentially. I'm not suggesting that we need to do it on dock estate, though. We want to keep those conservation forests. But this is maybe an option that we should be developing for landowners. Jumping back to New Zealand, thinking about agroforestry, that integration of trees into farms. This is actually an example from the South Waikato area. It's a dairy farm where they're also growing a high-value timber species, Polonia. So it's an exotic species, but getting really good benefits from mixing those two land uses together. They're getting carbon credits from the trees because this does qualify as a forest. They're getting income from the dairy. They're getting income from the timber. Although it's an exotic species, I would argue that there's better biodiversity values here than maybe a traditional dairy farm. I'm sure that we could debate that a little bit, but I still think it's somewhat of an improvement. And they're able to protect, soil from erosion. Their animals are less stressed in hot summers because there's more shade, trying to get those multiple benefits together. And I'm really keen in the work that we do that we try and move away from this kind of us and them with agriculture and forestry and move more to how do we integrate the systems together and get a kind of a win-win scenario. And I think we have a lot of options. One of our challenges is how do we take a system like this running on one farm, how do we actually grow it so that we can do it at bigger scales more reliably? So this particular farmer is a farm forestry expert. He's really honed it for his conditions. I know this particular system won't work everywhere, but how do we develop other systems that work in different locations? I also mentioned food forests as a new area that we're starting to think a lot about. We're very early in our thinking, but similarly, the food forest concept could fit into this kind of suite of tools and techniques that we could have integrating different production systems together. Kind of changing track a little bit, we've also just recently started thinking more about urban forestry. So this is thinking about those trees in cities, street trees in parks, people's backyards. This is quite a new area for Scion, and we're partnering up with other folks to really see and think about what our place in this area is. We don't want to compete, we want to work together. And really thinking about what do we know as experts in forests at Scion that we could learn and translate into the urban environments. Because under climate change in particular, this is going to be one of our biggest challenges. Our cities are going to get hotter. We're going to have more of those extreme events like the flooding in Auckland last year. And after that flooding, you might have heard people start talking about sponge cities. That's the kind of concepts that we're thinking about. How can trees be part of our cities, interact with the infrastructure, and really provide us with those benefits? We do also know that urban forests and green spaces have a tremendous benefit for community well-being and community health, which is definitely within our vision of a really prosperous New Zealand from trees. So one of the things we have done is earlier this year in April, we teamed up with University of Canterbury, Landcare, Christchurch City Council, and a few others, Orbika and Whaihua, to put together, we think it's the first of its kind, urban forestry symposium within New Zealand, trying to bring together policymakers, practitioners, and scientists to really talk about, so what is the challenge? Why aren't we seeing more trees? And we have a vision that we would love to see cities within New Zealand have 30% canopy cover within the next couple of decades, which is doable, but it is a challenge. And there's some real science challenges in figuring out how to get there, as well as really understanding the benefits of it. And then just the final example I wanted to show you is just carbon forestry. This is kind of our bread and butter business at the moment, thinking about how to store carbon in forests, but also how do we hold on to it through climate change and not let it be emitted again. And it is controversial, I acknowledge that, but I do think it has a place within New Zealand and is one of that suite of different options, particularly if we could pair the carbon benefit up with other uses as well. So one of the kind of bits of feedback I often get about the area I manage or the portfolio I lead within Scion is, holy crap, that's really ambitious. There's a lot in there, lots of different systems. You're crazy. How are you going to do that? That's a huge amount of work. And one thing that I keep emphasizing is it sounds really disparate and disconnected, but actually all of these systems have some real common threads. And what I'm hopeful is that we can learn from one area and apply it to other areas. So what are some of these common threads? One of my colleagues in industry, John Moore, sometimes says, well, we need to put the biology back into forestry. And he's absolutely right. For many of these questions, when we're thinking about new systems, new species, changes in climate, we need to start thinking about the basic biology of how do forests grow, how do species interact, what's going to happen to soil and water, that kind of thing. And we need to start thinking about these forests as complex adaptive systems. So we have feedback loops and those things going on, which I'm sure everybody listening to this seminar is well aware of these ideas. We also have the impact of stress on these systems and the way that these systems can ameliorate stress. So things like climate change is definitely one of those stresses that we could learn from one system how to respond, and it can teach us about other systems. We have a bunch of new technologies that have either come online or are coming our way. I'm thinking the remote sensing tools and some of those other technologies for monitoring ecosystems. And they're not limited to just one forest system or another. We could use them across most of these systems. Just the nuts and bolts of understanding how to manage trees. That's one of the common themes across these different types of forestry we could be doing. The measurement and the integration of different ecosystem services together. That's really common across all of these systems. The fact that we're focusing on human and community well-being, so connecting people to forests, there's a lot of work that's needed in that space. Planning and governance challenges that seem to be the same across these different forest systems, combining those multiple benefits together, and then applying those learnings from one system to another. So I'm hoping that you can see now what some of those common threads are in that mismatch of grey area of potential management. So as a forester, this is kind of how I see the planning process for forests, how we decide what forests we want and where we put them. So we very much start at the top with what is our purpose, what's our goals, where are we, what are the constraints, both biophysical and socioeconomic constraints. And then from there, that drives your choices about which species and what kind of management you do. But in the coming challenge that we see, we can't just think about that as what's happening right now. We also need to think about that in terms of what the future site will look like. What's the future of climate change? And that in itself is a huge challenge. We do use a lot of kind of forest modelling techniques. But that, I think, is one place where we need to do some real focus, and it's a common thread across all of those forest systems. I also have been really advocating for the adaptive management approach. So I often get asked after speaking by forest managers of like, well, where do we start? Like, what do I do first? And when I tell them, hey, we've got a little bit of research to do and it's going to take us 20 years, you can imagine they're not very happy. And so I think adaptive management is our way forward. They can't wait. Climate change is happening. Biodiversity crisis is happening. We're seeing the effects of these storms. People cannot wait for scientists to figure this out and then hand the solution over. Even if we did that, the problem probably will have changed by the time we have the solution. So the idea is that we work closely across science and industry or landowners, forest managers, and work with them to figure out, well, what are the things they should be trying? Let's monitor the outcomes of the different activities. Let's work together to figure out what's working, what isn't, and then learn from that. And it's really a cycle of continuous improvement. That shouldn't be the only science we do. We should do other experiments as well, but we need to be working really closely across with forest managers. And just the last point that I'd want to leave you with is just that New Zealand is a fairly unique place. Some of these management systems that are being used overseas are potentially really, could be really valuable in New Zealand. But we can't just pick them up and drop them in New Zealand. You know, New Zealand has different biology, different kinds of sites and climates, and we have a really different culture as well. So obviously we've got a long history of Maori tikanga as well. And so we really have this lovely opportunity to work together and co-develop these really unique versions of these systems in New Zealand and figure out what kind of place-based forestry might look like. So that's all I have to share with you guys. It's a very high-level view of kind of what my vision might be. I realize it's not the only vision, But I am really excited just to share it with you and hear people's thoughts and questions. But also, this is an opportunity, if there's anything in here that sounds kind of exciting, might align with things that you're thinking about or working on. If you can see space for collaboration, feel free to reach out or chat to me at any time. If I'm not the person, I'm more than happy to also connect you with other folks within Scion that are working in these different spaces as well. So thank you very much for your time. And I'm guessing we have a bit of time for questions.
Yeah, so it looks like there's 2 questions online. I think perhaps we should open it up to the room first.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the room, were there any questions or comments? Yeah, Kerry.
Thank you so much. I'm totally on board with pretty much all those ideas, so love that. I was thinking a lot about, at least for Aotearoa, this is a lot of what you're proposing. This maybe a paradigm shift. Can we call it? I don't know if it's that major, but yeah, kind of. And so I wondered what you thought about as the major drivers or the buttons. I think we need to change to get that paradigm ushered in.
Absolutely. So Kerry's asking about the paradigm shift and kind of what are the big buttons that we need to push to get that shift. With some of my colleagues at Scion, I have talked a lot about the disconnect between people and forests, and I think that's a big part that we need to overcome. And I do think urban forestry might be a way through that, really kind of connecting them with the forest that is right there. But I do think that that's one of the major shifts. You know, at the moment, I get the feeling, and I'm sure social scientists have looked at this a lot more closely than me, but I get the feeling that a lot of New Zealanders, you know, a forest is something over there where somebody does something, but I don't really see it. I don't really connect that that's where my house products come from, or that's what where my food comes from, or whatever it is. So I think that disconnect is one that's a major challenge for us. New Zealanders are very black and white in our thinking about our land use, and I would like to see more of a conversation about that grey space in between. You know, I do get a lot of comments from the general public about, oh, forestry, that's bad, you're bad for the environment. And I mean, they're not wrong. There are some things we need to improve on, but there's also some really cool things happening as well. We do have endangered species in New Zealand that live very happily in plantation forests, and they do provide some habitat values. They're not old growth native forests, but they're also not supermarket parking lots. So I think we need to have more conversation about that grey space. Yeah, but it is a paradigm shift, and I acknowledge that we some of these things we definitely don't have that social license at the moment to think about. Yeah.
Is there much of a price premium to doing this forestry where you're not just doing a clean cut and you're going in and doing a curated cut?
I guess the answer is it depends. And it depends on what your markets are, where you are, those kinds of things. And keep in mind that we're always trying to match your species and your site to the system that you're trying to use. So there are some really valid reasons why we use clear cuts in places. And there are some places where it is the best option, particularly those species that need more light, need more disturbance to regenerate and grow. But there are other places where absolutely it is the worst thing that we could do. So it is a grey area. I think the price premium comes, well, there's 2 places where we could get a price premium for changing our forest systems. One is changing the species. So we do have some species that are better used for decorative purposes, flooring, furniture. You can imagine those are higher value maybe than something like radiata, which is more of a structural timber and pulp and paper. So switching species might help. We need to do a lot of work to develop markets for some of those in New Zealand. The other place that we do see price premiums is the kind of labelling of sustainable products, which plantations can also have those labels as well if they're managed in the correct ways. But we do see not necessarily a price premium, but an access into markets for FSC and other certified woods that are demonstrating that they're sustainable. Yeah, so I guess there's some potential there, but there needs to be able to work as well. Yeah, but economics is a big part of this, right? Landowners just don't have the capacity to do different kinds of management without being able to see that economic support come back. Yeah.
Really quickly, I'm just wondering if you could quickly expand on what do you define as a food forest, and also how do we do urban food forests? Because I'm coming from Europe and I love in Spain where you've got some really citrus trees in the street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so a food forest is different from like a horticultural nut farm or fruit farm. It is different. A food forest has multiple species mixed together. And so it has kind of those, it's almost like you're creating an ecosystem. So you have a range of different functional types if you're an ecologist. So you have a multitude of different products in there. And there are some good examples in New Zealand of this happening at smaller scales. We don't really know what it would look like at a big scale, which we're interested in. How would you scale that up and what would that look like? So that's where we're in some really early thinking about it. But yeah, urban food forests is one place that people are really interested. So it's that mashup connection between the urban forestry and the benefits of trees in cities, but also trying to connect with issues around food sovereignty and access to nutritious good foods within urban environments. So there is a real interest in that as well. Yeah. And some great examples from overseas of potential things that could be happening. I know in urban forestry, there is often discussions and debates about the role of fruit trees, because if the fruit's not getting used, it can be a big mess, which can be a negative. But if you have the right kind of connections to the community and distribution systems, they can provide these extra benefits as well. Yeah.
They want to check to see. So if you go up to the top, stop sharing, but
Sorry.
there's 4 things in the chat.
Oh, it's great to see that colleague Paul is online, and great to see your feedback, Paul. And Peter Casey. Peter's asking, what initiatives should we be taking up to help forest managers upskill and better forest design? I think part of it is that adaptive management cycle, and getting foresters really on board with that. That they, unfortunately, monitoring is the first thing that goes every time that budgets are cut, but it's probably one of the most important things we should be doing, is making sure that we're constantly monitoring and learning from what we're doing and improving. So I guess that's one of the major things. One of the other ones is just greater connections between people and the researchers, the industry, the landowners, and the science that's happening. And I think all the scientists on the seminar will understand the challenges of that tech transfer. How do you take science and actually turn it into something useful, which is an ongoing challenge that we need to get a bit better at. So Chris is asking if Scion's currently doing anything with native beach silviculture. That's a great question. I do know of conversations happening. I don't have examples off the top of my head of actual active research happening right now that I can share. But certainly there has been some discussions more recently about both on the wood side of native beach and how do we use the wood, what could it be used for, those kinds of conversations, as well as, well, how do we manage those forests sustainably? Yeah, and I'm more than happy to connect you, Chris, if you want to reach out afterwards. I can connect you with some of our Indigenous silviculture folks if you want to dive into some more details.
Thank you.
Yeah, Joshua.
So you seem to say in your kind of cycle of thinking that there were some decisions that would then have to kind of go back into perhaps re-looking at the purpose of the forest. And so in the coastal sciences, there's the dynamic adaptive pathways kind of planning. Understanding that coastal sciences and forests have vastly different timelines on things. Is there something like that that could be applied to kind of consider the purposes of forests over time and perhaps where decision points might need to change that purpose of the forest?
And you're thinking in terms of climate change?
In terms of climate change, but also in terms of maybe other other things that could come along.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do know the reason why I ask is that I know in the climate change space there is quite a bit of work happening, trying to understand what might happen to different forest types under climate change moving forward. Trying to understand under different scenarios what might happen. That kind of research in itself does give us some information about, well, what are the challenges facing different species or different forest systems, and which ones do we need to be worried about and trying to make changes to, and which ones are we, pretty confident might do okay in the future. So there is a lot of that kind of work happening using forest growth models and various climate change scenarios. I think in the indigenous species space, my understanding is that for an indigenous forest, we actually have a lot less information than we do for our exotic forests with climate change. But yeah, absolutely, we need to, as Kerry was asking earlier, there is a paradigm shift that's needed, and we do need to start thinking a little bit about black and white forest management and more of this grey in between. And many of our potential uses and benefits we get from forests are compatible. We can do both, clean them up together. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So we need to start thinking a bit more about that grey space, I think. Yeah. And we could definitely learn from other land users and other industries. I think my understanding is kind of agriculture has probably done a lot more in that climate change space, and forestry, we're trying to catch up a bit more. Yeah.
Must have chosen the loudest chair. So on behalf of ERI, we'd like to thank you with something that is
Thank you.
made out of wood.
Love it.
And thank you very much for sharing your knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I was saying, feel free, anybody that's online or in the room, if you want to reach out at any time, please do that. I'm more than happy to connect you to other folks in Zion or explore some of these spaces together as well. Thank you.
Good job.